At least let's hope that as we progress, others are going to join. But I'm anyway proceeding because unlike the information that I gave you, that I may not progress with the content in the live interaction, I'll be doing it incrementally in this because of the lag that we have so far in catching up with the content. So what I'm planning is give you some sort of an introduction to the second theoretical framework that we are investigating. Okay, so as usual, if you have questions, you can comment or raise your hands and or say speak directly, because of the population. It's around a dozen people, so that's also welcome. Now, the traditional understanding that we learned along with the beginning of deontology was that we have a traditional understanding of judgments varying from subjectivity to objectivity, and at the same time we also have a traditional understanding of knowledge varying between reason and experience. Kant proposed that, and he argued for the fact that moral truths, if they are moral truths, then they are on par with universal laws, and if they are on par with universal laws, then it has to be objective. Okay, it has to be objective, and the way we can come up with objective truths is by using our reason, very similar to the use of reason in mathematics. And I've shown you, if you had watched the previous clip, how we can sort of derive truth or falsity of moral claims. Okay, so I'm not getting into that, but the other important point that I remarked there was the distinction between hypothetical and categorical imperatives. So along with that, we have got a couple of methods, two of them similar to mathematics, the other one about not making the human being an object, or not using the human being as a means but as an end, treating the human being as an end. And in other words, the instrumental notion of humans or human beings are denied in favor of a position where you take the human being with some worth or some value. And I discussed, if I remember correctly, the case of an accident near a bush where a person stops or doesn't stop, etc. Okay, so proceeding. So given the recap, if we proceed, there were a couple of questions through email about the clip that I had forwarded. So somewhere along that clip, I said that you have to understand the fact that if someone is doing an act for its own sake, for the sheer pleasure of it, okay, and I think that created a bit of confusion. Now, the difference between hypothetical imperative and categorical imperative is that if we are performing an act for something intentionally, then it's not a categorical imperative. So even if I am performing an act for deriving pleasure from the act, then it's hypothetical imperative. It's not a categorical imperative. But if in the process of the act, pleasure is an outcome, a natural outcome, okay, take for example studying or reading something, it gives a feeling of enhancement for your own self, right, at the end of acquiring that knowledge or during that process. Now, if we are intentionally aiming for the pleasure, then it's not a categorical imperative. I think that's where the confusion lies. And if I'm remembering correctly, I gave the example of a small child doing something for the sake of it. Okay, that example is probably misleading, but the closest that I can see in movies is this character played by Amir Khan. In this movie titled Three Idiots. Okay, there he runs categorical imperatives, and I think if Kant were alive today, he would have approved that you pursue knowledge for knowledge's own sake, for knowing. Okay, and it will be a pleasurable activity, but the pleasure is just an outcome. Okay, and again the same thing goes for any other act. Okay, so if we are playing a sport, we are not playing for the pleasure of it, but for the value of that process. Okay, these are not moral acts, but in moral acts it's much more important to understand the value within the process. Okay, otherwise there will be guilt, and there will be a lot of other issues that happen afterwards. Say for example, treating someone when he or she is not well. Okay, and again taking someone to hospital, or forgetting about your own plans when someone is in dire need of some help. Okay, so these are in a certain sense universalizable according to Kant. Okay, whereas the reductio, the opposite of that, will not yield fruit, and it will lead to inconsistency. Okay, I think there's some clarity right now. And so there was a movement in the 1800s and almost towards the early 20th century, up to early 20th century, was known as art for art's sake. Okay, so the best example is Van Gogh, where he did not paint for money, okay, or fame or something else, but he painted for its own worth, the process's worth. Okay, now someone might just ask me, didn't Van Gogh paint for pleasure? I will have to really ask Van Gogh, but my assumption is that he valued painting for its own sake, but then pleasure, the kind of joy that comes out of that process, will be a byproduct. Okay, and again the kind of framework that we have in Eastern traditions is almost similar to Kant's categorical imperative. The Sankhya philosophy, for example, and you might have seen this in various versions, that forget about the result and do the act for its own sake. Okay, and someone going in that direction, say for example studying for its own sake and not really worried about the results, might get good results. Okay, so what is important is the intention in the actor, in the agent. Okay, if the intention is always results, consequence, or something that comes out, then it straight away becomes a hypothetical imperative. Okay, so simple examples like the movie that I spelled out, and again Van Gogh is another example, and probably in history there are many people who went through a process for its own sake. Okay, so that's deontology for you, and what I'm planning right now. If you have questions, you can always counter me, or write it somewhere here. I don't know how to really pick up the comments. Okay, so we were uh, discussing deontology, and today we are sort of advancing to utilitarianism. I gave you glimpses of utilitarianism probably in the last live interaction, and already you might have grasped that the idea of utility, okay, is given prominence over the act itself. Okay, so the worth of the act, the constitutive features of the act is undermined in favor of utility, and we'll see what that is. So there are many names for utilitarianism, and in the same way there are many names for deontology as well. Deontology is sometimes known as constitutivism. Okay, constitutivism, because what constitutes an action is its internal worth rather than its external, worth, such as consequences. In utilitarianism, we have another model or framework where we look for happiness of the greatest number of people involved post the action. That means after the act has been performed. Okay, so the founder figures are on the left side. We have Jeremy Bentham, who was an English parliamentarian as well as a great orator, and author of multiple books. And in his book Morals and Legislations, he gives this in 1888, gives this sentence that it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. So go back to the question about copying or cheating in the exam. If it provides the greatest happiness to the greatest number, then cheating is all right. Okay, and on the right side we have John Stuart Mill, again another influential figure who contributed a lot to the area known as ethics, and also in other areas like reasoning and so on and so forth, especially political philosophy. He made a subsequent remark that happiness in a certain sense is a vague word. Now in this definition of utilitarianism, how do we really know what is meant by happiness? The second order discourse again, what do you mean by happiness? Okay, so J.S. Mill, John Stuart Mill, claimed that it shouldn't be the the cases like sensual pleasure, the taste that we have, that we derive while eating food, or the kind of intimate pleasures that we have in sexual activities and so on and so forth. So he claimed that greatest happiness in a certain sense means once the act is performed, the number that is affected, the population that's affected, should be having a kind of contented state, that they should be satisfied and their lives should not be affected detrimentally. Okay, so here again an issue with interpretation. Okay, so just imagine copying in an exam. How many people will be affected with that? It's difficult to calculate, and I will show you why is it difficult to sort of quantify happiness. Okay, and there are many ways to do that, but I'm going to show you a very rough way of getting on with it. So consider this example that I gave you, where the accident happens while I am heading to, not I, but I gave the individual A in that. In the book it's Jack or someone. Okay, so any individual X or Y, if he or she is suppose going to airport and witnesses an accident, there's no one around, there are there is no cell phone network, and it's a mutually exclusive action between choosing either to help or miss the flight. Okay, just imagine. Now, according to utilitarianism, what we can do is consider all the possible alternative actions. So in here we have the columns suggesting all the possible alternative actions. So we have A1, maybe helping, stopping for that person or not, etc. Be it any action or any moral act, copying or not copying, etc. And then also consider the individuals involved. Okay, so P1 is one individual, P2 is another, etc. And then we have Pn. And at the end, what we do when we apply the utilitarian method is take the sum and see whether it's a considerably negative sort of set of numbers, okay, or considerably positive set of numbers. So in that case, in that particular case where I discussed the accident, okay, when something like this, so this is my own table, and you can create your own, but the difficulty is again quantifying happiness. Okay, so the case of an individual A rushing to the airport and so on and so forth. So the reason why I'm showing the image is because if I show the image, then probably you will remember the example better. So an upside down car, downhill on a bush or something. Okay, and you see people are hurt. Should we stop or shouldn't we stop? Sometimes people also believe that on a busy road, if something of this happens, they may not stop, thinking that the person coming behind might just stop and help, given the fact that we don't have enough time left for something else. But again, that's scrutinized. So what if A does not help? And in here we have the option to not help, or that man has the option to not help. And so what's the consequence of that action for A? Now, sorry, it should be +3 here, because he is leaving the site or fleeing the site without helping the individuals involved in the accident. So I'm sorry about the negative sign there. So if A does not help for A, he will be catching the flight, so he can get onto the flight, right? So it's advantage for him. Okay, but if A is helping the individuals involved, then he will have -3 or something of that sort. Okay, so the actor, the agent himself or herself, will gain or lose based on the consequence. Okay, now what about the injured passengers? Now if he doesn't help, then obviously, again, I got it all wrong. It should be, say, -6 here. Okay, so 2 people involved. So for 2 people, just assume that you have a rough calculation. It could be above 3 as well. The value could be above 3 depending on the intensity and the gravity of the effect, consequence. Okay, so now we have a +3 here at the end. Okay, now if A helps, then what happens is that A loses out, okay, -3, but then these 2 people gains on that, so it should be positive 7 here. Okay, and so you have positive 14, and the net will be plus 11. Okay, now you might want to ask, how did I come up with the numbers for a certain individual's benefit? Okay, now this is the issue with utilitarianism, that it will be difficult to even calculate the numbers, the benefit for the people that are immediately involved in the incident. Okay, now this is just about the individual and the injured passengers, but what about the people who are connected to them? Okay, so if, for example, if I don't get into a plane, and if that means I am missing out on something so big, okay, then one can obviously assign a greater number there, okay, a greater number to the loss in the negative sense. And what if the injury is very minimal, like if they have just a scratch and they can stand up, and if they are saying that, it's fine, you can go get your catch your flight, we will manage on our own, then it won't be a minus, it won't be a -3 here. Okay, it could be -1 or something of that sort. So excuse me. So what we need to understand is the gravity of the effect on each of these people who are around, and at the same time the mutual, related actors or agents around the individuals who are involved. So the classic question here is that all of these are mutually exclusive events. I mean, either helping or not helping. In the same way, there was a discussion by a philosopher called Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist, who gives this puzzle. If, say, take for example the same individual A, if A's mother is seriously unwell and probably she's going through a bad she's going through a serious illness that requires his or her attention, the individual's attention. But just imagine that if the individual is also an armed personnel serving the country, and it seems that a war has broken out. Okay, so the regiment or the unit in which he or she is employed is asking the person to come back, but the mother is not well in home. I mean, I think there are similar stories portrayed in movies where it is straight away decided at the first order and says that, oh, I need to really go and attend the call of duty because it's about the country and I need not have to stay with my mother. But just to give a twist, just even imagine that the mother and the son or the daughter has not seen each other for years, and this is probably some unique kind of union between them, and it's so valuable to them that they want to stay with the mother. Okay, now in here again, how would we quantify the overall happiness? Okay, so if it could, I mean, there could be chance operations in all these actions, like A may go for the war and might just die instantly. Okay, and another chance operation might yield another result. Say, for example, if A stays back, after a while, suppose his mother gets better, then he joins war, then probably it could also go in this direction, that then A could actually capture, say, some enemy territory or something of that sort. So the uncertainty about how things will span out in the future is the second sort of criticism that goes against utilitarianism. The first one being the difficulty with quantification. Okay, so if you just put numbers in such a way that it all looks pretty easy in this way, that how everyone is affected in terms of benefit and harm, and just quantify it and then sum it up, and then you get a action. So unlike the deontological methods that I showed you, this quantification in the case of utilitarianism can be quite subjective. Okay, it could be very subjective. I mean, just imagine copying in the exam. Now you are creating a table, people around you and their benefits and their happiness, etc., along with the other action of not copying in the exam. Okay, and so on and so forth. Some of these are clear cut. You directly get a higher value for the right action. Okay, but some of these are not that straightforward. Okay, so just to contrast, in deontology we go with the principle behind the process. Okay, the principle behind the action. In here we go with the consequence of the action. Okay, we gauge or weigh the consequence. Okay, so in the example that I gave you about the son or the daughter and call of duty contrasting with the care for the mother, there could be multiple actions available. Okay, multiple negotiations, actions, etc., and most of it are not in our purview to really foresee, okay, as to how future will span out. Okay, so that's the difficulty. And now what you would want to do, and I'm going to send you the literature, 3-4 pages only, between deontology and utilitarianism. You can clearly see how people morally reason. Okay, now let me also give you a sort of caveat. The caveat is this, that governmental policies, okay, policies by governments mostly rely on, at least in the democratic setup, mostly rely on the utilitarian method. Okay, they do this exercise at least in an algorithmic way. Say whether to construct a dam in a district in a particular area or not, how many people will benefit, how many people will lose out. Okay, very similar to the cost benefit analysis that you do in economics, but in here you're quantifying the net benefit in terms of happiness. Okay, and say for example, if somebody performs, say somebody is culpable of murder, heinous murders, okay, of the rarest kind, and the nation is sort of thinking in an utilitarianist perspective. If we execute the person, what are the benefits? If we try to approach with the reformist strategies, what are the benefits? Okay, so policies mostly rely on utilitarian methods, and if you see the British system, okay, that was also available here before the 1940s. What happened was that the philosophy by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill completely, in a certain sense, I would say 80 to 90% turned their approach towards the utilitarian method. Okay, so instead of sending someone to the electric chair or the to the noose, what basically they did was that they arranged for a calculation as to whether this person, if sent to a life in prison with some reformist strategies like re-educate that person in a certain way and make that person feel the guilt, and then that sort of gets back into society in a certain sense, as to say in terms of lessons. Okay, so this is again available in movies. If you had seen movies such as The Dead Man Walking, okay, there's some aspects of this debate going on. Okay, and a lot of our decisions unawareingly are utilitarian. Okay, just for the sake of information, I am saying that this has got a similarity with hypothetical imperative, but it is not hypothetical imperative in itself. Okay, because in hypothetical imperative, any sort of outcome that is favored by the individual is preferred, but in utilitarianism, it's not any sort of outcome or any consequence, but the consequence that maximizes happiness. Okay, so I'm going to stop. It was a 30-minute monologue. I'm sorry about that. If you have questions, you can come in. Otherwise, we call it a day. I hope you got a gist of what I was trying to say, at least.
So, do these theories apply to humans only? Can we generalize them to non-human things like nature or animals?
I should have clarified this in the beginning, that there are different versions of utilitarianism available now. Since you asked, and it's a great question, that now the whole strategy about utilitarianism also merges into, say, discussions about sustainability, nature, animals, and so on. So there was an argument about going vegetarian or not based on utilitarianism. I don't know whether you had seen that. I mean, it's in the book by Yuval Noah Harari, the famous book called *Sapiens*. In his work, he argues that if you look at the sum total of suffering, all these industrialized farms, and animals are just treated in a certain way to get bigger and bigger, and then human beings execute them to eat meat, etc. The utilitarian argument claims that we should go veg. Okay, but again, quantification is an issue here. But the problem with quantifying happiness and suffering is a difficult thing to really catch hold of. What do we mean by nature's suffering, and what do we mean by animals? At least we can see that they are in pain, right? And how much is overall happiness? But Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, when they initially launched the program, this framework, their understanding is that it's for the human beings. Okay, it's only for the human beings. But 20th century thinkers have sort of extended it to animals, and it's not just for human beings in a particular context, such as, say, our own country or our own district, but it's human beings globally. Okay, so if we do an action here, its consequence leads to suffering in other countries or other places, the kind of thing that you see with global warming, the carbon emissions created by developed countries such as US and so on, and the European Union, it's outweighs the kind of emissions that the developing countries are right now doing. So this kind of debate, I mean, it's quite possible, and in this course we are not getting into utilitarianist approach as a whole taking in nature and animals and everyone. We are just getting into the basic framework. Okay, how do we quantify pleasure, and is it possible to quantify pleasure? So I mean, I don't know. I mean, I've said this to many students that so there are people who are arguing, say, in this sense that the whole world is suffering, and it would be better if the population is really less, so that there is greater happiness. Okay, and going in this direction itself is a challenging pursuit. Just imagine the pre-agrarian societies. I'm talking about, say, 15,000 years back. Okay, hunters and gatherers and foragers. They were much. I mean, again, I don't know. I couldn't travel back and ask a hunter and gatherer, were you happy more? And can I sort of compare it with all these burdens that we have in the modern world? Starting from waking up to all the routines, and even with the agrarian societies, the kind of pain and pressure that he or she had with seasons, and all sorts of mental stress, etc., etc. So probably the hunters and gatherers, pre-agrarian societies, were much happier. Okay, and they inflicted less harm to the world. But in our case, so again, since you asked this question, some of the nation states such as Sweden and the Scandinavian regions, they talk about happiness. Okay, that's the net aim of a country, or say a group. And in here we actually do pretty badly in that index. Okay, I think we are, if we count from the from the last, we are probably number 2 or number 3. That means we are probably the unhappier lot in the whole world. Okay, and there could be reasons for that, but again, how do we quantify it? Okay, and what sort of pleasure do we quantify? Okay, so drug abuse. This is an example that one of your seniors 3-4 years back asked me when I was standing outside of Transit campus. A single dose of marijuana gives you a particular quantity of pleasure. This was his argument basically. And then for some reason, I'm not going to name anyone, and say, if you study for exams and get satisfaction, etc., and at the end you get a job, and again the routine goes on for another 30-40 years, and finally everything is done, okay, when people die. So he was basically saying that if you have high intensity pleasure and happiness for a short period of time, isn't it enough really, according to utilitarian thinking? And shouldn't we pursue those, okay, in comparison with the others? Again, I don't know. Okay, I don't have a clear-cut answer here. Maybe from the individual's point of view, that's giving a particular kind of pleasure, it's valued higher in scale compared to other pleasures, but I'm not very sure. I mean, how do we go? But if we take the net happiness, okay, net happiness meaning people around him and so on and so forth. In this case, I mean, he and his drug dealer and a few others would be happy. He would be, of course, scoring high on the happiness and pleasure index. But what about the others? Okay, what about the kind of consequences again that this process, this act leads to? Okay. So this is a tricky question. I get that. Okay, and if we extend it to nature and animals, a lot of it's how should I put it? It's like a container within which there is another issue, within which there is another issue, and it goes never ending. But what I wanted to introduce in this lecture was that at least there is a possibility to gauge right and wrong based on consequences, and not just only about not just only in the Kantian way, in the deontological way, through the worth of the act itself. Okay, so so the Chinese say that I'm not very sure whether I answered it. And at the undergraduate level, my biggest challenge is that there are several areas where answers to questions are not very absolute. Okay, whereas you are actually seeking answers to questions in an absolute way, in proper definitions. I am trying to give that, but these kinds of issues like criticisms of utilitarianism, it's little difficult. I mean, you take any textbook, you will find this kind of open-ended gray areas. So can excess of happiness cause unhappiness? That's what the Buddhists also believed. Okay, so so if we again bring back the John Stuart Mill versus Bentham debate as to what counts as happiness, is it the immediate chemical releases in the brain? Okay, say when you read a book or when you do something, it's the chemical releases happening, some sort of neuron firing, and when you do exercise you get some sort of happiness. When you are engaged in say sex, there is a certain kind of happiness, and so on. All these are triggered by various chemicals. These are not in our control. Okay, the whole point that John Stuart Mill, and of course the Buddhists also, and the Chinese probably, were saying that there is a way in which we can control them. Okay, so the example that I can give is a tiger hunting its prey. The prey comes in front of the tiger, and if the tiger is hungry, the instinct sort of takes over, and then the tiger will pursue the prey. Okay, now human beings are not like that. Human beings can actually rationally think over the action, okay, and get away from that, stay away from that. Okay, so they have a certain ability to not naturally act, or not say non-naturally act on something. Okay, so you say, for example, in a relationship, hormones and other chemicals in the body, the kind of hard wiring of the brain, etc., will dictate terms, but at the same time we are equipped with reason. Okay, so the argument goes like this, that if we use that reason, and if we stay away probably from the naturalness that we have, then it yields greater happiness. Okay, but that's a different sort of happiness that is in the Eastern tradition. A lot of this is discussed in the in the Middle Eastern traditions, like the Islamic thoughts and the medieval period, as well as in the ancient thoughts in India. They all have a different perspective like this, that human being can in a certain way go against nature. Okay, go against his or her own nature. So so this basic indulgence in desire and pleasure, if we avoid that, we get greater happiness. Okay, but if it is the basic pleasure and desire after which we are going forward, or we are sort of going after, then it eventually leads to unhappiness or suffering. Okay, and the Buddhist term is that attachment leads to suffering, because once we pursue it, and the end result of pursuing that object or whatever creates a kind of vacuum. Okay, but the brain still wants it. Okay, and it will start firing some other chemicals, and then that leads to depression and so on. Okay, so I agree that excess happiness will cause unhappiness, but it's excess happiness of a certain kind, okay, of a lower natural level, of natural level desires. But wouldn't that other happiness, happiness in the sense of contentedness, create unhappiness? The answer is no, it won't. Probably you will be okay with it, okay, and so you can still be happy in dire situations if you are not aiming for the natural sort of desires and happiness. Anyway, I'm not getting into that tradition. We will digress, but it is a good question that it's not just the Chinese, the Indians as well as many other schools had asked this question. Okay, so quick recap. Unlike deontology, utilitarians focus on consequences of action, and not just any consequence, but the consequence that leads to overall happiness, okay, or of all the people who are affected with that consequence. Now, two quick criticisms. It's difficult to quantify pleasure because there are various types of pleasure and various degrees it may happen, and at the same time, if what was the other? I forgot. If we sum it up, the uncertainty about future and the random chance operations that we have may just be unreachable from our, or unseeable from our perspective, that we get a hang of all the chain consequence reactions, okay. So the unpredictability of the future is another criticism, along with the difficulty with quantification. The method is always the same: immediate benefactors of the action and non-benefactors of the action, and you sort of do a rough quantification on that, and you will get simply, okay, for any action. So we saw that in the accident case, probably helping was the right action, because that would have caused more happiness, okay. And again, in a real life situation, I don't know whether you do it algorithmically, but it definitely will run. If you are a utilitarian, run it in your mind whether to stop or not to stop, but your brain will be saying, do the instinctual calculation in your mind, is it okay to stop or not. But for the deontologist, there is no question about not stopping. He or she should stop. It's for the worth of the action that he or she is doing it, okay. Yeah, so I'm stopping because it's already 40 minutes, and yeah, more interesting examples will come, and we will march on to virtue theory. And if I can, I will conduct a quiz on next Wednesday. I'm not very sure about that, but I'll announce it tomorrow if it's possible, with only deontology and utilitarianism and the other stuff that we have discussed so far. But if not, we'll bring in virtue theory as well and see all the three perspectives, and then conduct the quiz, okay. So anything else? Great. So I'll see you next week, either with the quiz or with the normal interaction, okay. So I don't see any hands or any comments. Okay, you can also email me your questions, and again, don't expect yes or no answers from me, like should I go for war or should I treat my mother. If it's a mutually exclusive case, maybe both are correct, okay, from different perspectives. So I'll leave it to you to finally be the adjudicator and take what framework you want to apply, okay. So I'll see you next week then. See you.